We are reviewing the Sichas volume 21, the Sicha of Vayakhel, regarding the laws of the Beis HaBechira. This is also a siyum in the Rambam on the laws of the Beis HaBechira. Let's open up and take a look at what are the closing laws, as you do by a siyum, of the section of Beis HaBechira. So it's in the box in front of you. These are the last two laws. There's 8 chapters in the section called Hilchos Beis HaBechira, the laws of the Holy Temple. And chapter 8, the last 2 laws are in front of you. And what are they about? They're about the daily procedure that was done first thing in the morning. That the guy in charge of the temple would show up bright and early, before dawn, what have you, and he would meet the groups of priests, and they would take torches, and they would divide up in a couple of groups and circulate the entire Beis HaMikdash courtyard, what have you, and then they would meet back together. And then when they met back together, it meant that everything is in order, because they did the whole circle. Everything is in place and ready to begin the daily service, and they would declare peace, shalom, hakol shalom, everything is peace. Then the last halacha, it says that this pattern followed each night except on Shabbos. But on Shabbos, they did not take torches for this inspection because it's Shabbos. Instead, they checked the courtyard and the temple, etc., by the light of the candles that were burning there from before Shabbos. So the Rebbe has a question which is asked by many commentaries, and this is the main question of the Sicha: why not hold the torches? Rambam says that because it's Shabbos, they did not hold torches, but they rather made use of the torches that were lit before Shabbos. Why not? Carrying a torch on Shabbos is a rabbinic restriction. It's called a shvus. That's the word you want to learn if you're not familiar with it for this Sicha, shvus. It's a rabbinic enactment, a rabbinic restriction. To light a fire on Shabbos, of course, is a Torah restriction, a Torah prohibition. However, to hold a pre-lit torch is a rabbinic restriction. It's a shvus, and there's a rule: ein shvus b'mikdash. The Beis HaMikdash, there were no restrictions that were rabbinic. The Beis HaMikdash is so holy, and the Kohanim are so careful, and therefore they override the shvus. And the logic is that the reason why the sages made these restrictions, in order to make a fence around the Torah, we shouldn't violate Torah. But the Kohanim's reasoning, the language is, the Kohanim, the priests, were so alacritive, so careful in mitzvahs, we're not afraid that they're going to make a mistake. And therefore, shvus overrides, temple overrides shvus. The most famous example of this, and there are many, but the most famous is that they blew the shofar on Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos in the Beis HaMikdash, even though they didn't blow it anywhere else. And why didn't they blow it anywhere else? Because of a shvus, a rabbinic restriction. We're afraid that you might come to carry it in a public domain. However, in the Beis HaMikdash, they weren't afraid. So shvus is overridden by temple. So the question becomes, why were they not able to carry these candles? Again, this is asked by the Kesef Mishnah, by commentary. So the Rebbe proposes 2 answers, but does not accept either one. The first answer he's proposing is actually getting from other commentary, and that is that this allowance is only when there's no other alternative. This principle, ein shvus b'mikdash, that we don't worry about rabbinic enactments and restrictions in the temple, there's only when there's no other way to get the job done. But if you can do it without overriding the shvus, why override the shvus? Why break a rabbinic enactment when there's other ways to do it? And in this case, it's clearly another way to do it. Namely, use the candles that were burning from before. There were candles all over, which constantly were there. Use them. Why override the shvus when you don't need to? So that's the proposed answer, which is brought in some of the commentaries. Says the Rebbe, doesn't like that answer. It's not satisfactory. And why? Because we find very often that the shvus is overridden in the temple, even in a case when there are other alternatives. And the Rebbe gives 2 examples, both related to the Kohen Gadol, the high priest on Yom Kippur. And if the Kohen Gadol is old, and he has to immerse in the mikveh a number of times, and the water can be very, very cold, and he's old, it's hard for him, so they would be able to heat up the mikveh. And they would do it in a certain fashion by throwing into the mikveh these preheated metals, that we're laying on fire, that is a shvus. That is a rabbinic restriction. However, they did it in the temple because the rule is there's no rabbinic restrictions in the temple. Now, there were other ways to do this. They could have just poured hot water into the cold, and you wouldn't even have you wouldn't be violating a rabbinic restriction. And yet, halacha is the Kohen is old and he's cold. Do the shvus, throw in the metals. It's okay. So we see that shvus is overridden in temple even when there's another alternative. Another example is if the high priest is starting to fall asleep. It's very important that he doesn't sleep all night. Lest, God forbid, we have to worry that maybe there was a seminal emission, which makes him unfit for the service, what have you. So they would keep him up all night. And if we see that he's falling asleep, the young Kohens would come and snap their fingers and do all kind of noises. And these noises are a shavus, as a rabbinic restriction against noise making on Shabbos. And yet they did it. Why? Because in the temple, we don't worry about shvus, even though there were other alternatives. You want to keep the Kohen awake? Tell him jokes. I don't know, make him walk around barefoot all night, make him stand. There are certainly other alternatives. And yet we see from these two examples, and apparently there are many others, the Rebbe maintains that ein shvus b'mikdash. We don't worry about rabbinic enactments in the mikdash. We don't ever. We don't care that there's another alternative. Which already this is a chiddush. This is an innovation of the Rebbe. Take a look in the commentary. Take a look at it in Encyclopedia Talmudis when he says under the entry ein shvus b'mikdash that there's no shvus in the temple. He says, but that's only when there's no other alternative. But when there's another alternative, we don't override the shvus in the temple. Where does he get it from? He gets it from this Rambam. But the Rebbe says that that's not satisfactory. So the Rebbe is taking a very strong position, somewhat innovative, and saying, no, the principle always stands. Even when there's another alternative, we don't worry about rabbinic enactments, rabbinic restrictions in the temple. It's not an issue. I don't care there's other alternatives. You have a problem with the Rambam. How come the Rambam says not to carry the torches? The Rebbe says we're going to find another solution. So then the Rebbe proposes a second answer, apparently his own proposal. And that is, it's true that shvus is suspended in the temple even when there is an alternative, but only as an exception and not as a consistent law. So for example, let's take the two examples before, where we see that the shvus is overridden in temple even when there's another alternative. The high priest is old, or he's falling asleep. These are exceptions. If it happens that he's old and he's cold and he can't go into the mikveh, you can warm it up. You don't worry about the shvus. If it happens that he's falling asleep, you can keep him awake and you don't have to worry about a shvus, because shvus is overridden in the temple. But to make a consistent law, which will be part of the system, that every morning they come along and they grab torches and they override the shvus every Shabbos, meaning, why do that? Why put a consistent law that overrides rabbinic law? Rabbinic law is, yes, it's overridden in the temple when needed, but we don't make it a consistent, like the language is, the Rebbe says, davar kavua, something consistent and a pattern. We prefer not to override the sages in such a fashion. And that would seem to answer our problem. Here, we're talking about a consistent pattern, using every single Shabbos morning the carrying of the candles, using the allowance of overriding the shvus. We don't want to do that. Maybe it's out of deference to the sages. We don't want to override them on a consistent basis. We have an allowance that we can override a shvus. We use it like when needed, when there's an exception, etc. So this might be a proposed answer, but the Rebbe refutes this as well. The Rebbe says, no, we find that the shvus is overridden, it's suspended in the temple, even when there is an alternative, and in consistent law. And what's the example the Rebbe cites? The Rebbe shows that when Erev Pesach is Shabbos, and you have to bring the sacrifices because it's a sacrifice for that day, it overrides Shabbos. And when it comes to the skinning of the animals, there's a whole discussion in the Talmud how to do it. And there's one way to do it that involves a shvus and another that does not. And whether you use tools or you do it by hand. And the halacha is that you're able to do it with the tools and you don't worry about the shvus. And this is a consistent law. This is not like it's happened that the high priest was old. It happened that he was falling asleep. It's not happened. Every number of years, Pesach, Erev Pesach is Shabbos. And now you have entered into halacha, consistent law, overriding the Shavuos. So we see clearly that the Rebbe has proven very strongly that Shavuos is suspended. Rabbinic restrictions are suspended in the temple, even when there's an alternative, and even when it's a consistent law. So we're back to our square one. Why not hold the torches? And why do we have to just walk around using the pre-existing flames? So, for the sake of clarity, I reposted the halacha. And the question that comes back to us, why not hold torches? But as the Rebbe often does, in order to answer a question, he first introduces a couple other questions. The Rebbe says, let's analyze the Rambam a little more. Why are 11 and 12 here in chapter 8? Chapter 8 is talking about the laws of the honor god, Shmiras HaMikdash, the honor of the guarding of the temple, which is really about kavod, honoring the temple. There were always Levites and different places stationed, not because of protection really, but because of honor. That's what chapter 8 is about. Why are we throwing in 11 and 12, which seemingly not about honor, but they're about the temple service? There's a whole separate section coming up later, which is called Tmidin U'Musafin. I'm translating it literally, not literally, laws of daily services. There's a whole section which gives like the schedule. They come in the morning, they check out the temple, they bring the morning offering, they bring the incense, they light the menorah. It's got the whole schedule. And over there too, it does mention briefly this morning routine, because it's the first thing that happens. And that's where it should belong. Why is it even here? This is the law of the guarding of the temple. That's what this chapter is about. So tell me, you have to guard it, where you have to guard it, and finish. Why does the Rambam throw in 11 and 12 this idea of coming in the morning and inspecting the temple? Let's call it Bedikas HaTemple. That's part of the service. That's not part of the honoring of the temple. Presumably, it belongs in the schedule section, and in fact, it appears there briefly. Why is it here? It's a very strong question. The Rambam is very famous for his precision and his order and the way he puts things and where he puts things. And by extension, another question, why is halacha 12 separate? Halacha 11, I cut it down, but it's a whole long thing that you carry the torches and you circulate and you check it out. 12 is just an extension. It should be at the end of 11. And by the way, if it's Shabbos, you can't carry the torch, you use the light. No, Rambam separates it as a separate halacha. And the Rebbe brings the footnotes that the Alter Rebbe learns many things from these divisions of the halachas. The Rambam didn't put numbers in, but he put them in separate paragraphs. And therefore, he's making a clear statement that this is something separate. This is important. This is actually the closing of the laws of the guarding of the temple, of the honor guard. Like, why make a separate halacha of just like a PS? What to do in the case of Shabbos? So these are the Rebbe's two additional questions. So the Rebbe says, and here is again another innovation. The Rebbe says, let's answer question one, the additional question. Why are the laws of Bedikas HaTemple, as I called it, of this morning inspection here in chapter 8, in the chapter that discusses the honor guard, when seemingly it should be in the section of the daily schedule, because it's not about a service. It is about honor. The fact that they came in the morning and they had two teams of Kohanes and they circulated the whole temple and they're carrying torches. It's not really because they were worried something was amiss. Nothing was amiss. Rather, this is a form of honor. And that's why it's at the end of this section. The Rambam, in his precision, includes the laws of the morning routine of checking the temple not in the section of the daily schedule, because it's not part of the service. It's not just like you light the menorah and you bring the daily offering and the morning offering, the incense. You also have to do the inspection. No, there was no need for the inspection on a practical basis. It was like the honor guard. It was there to show, aha, we come to the king's palace, we take a walk around, we got the flames. It was all about kavod, honor guard. And that's exactly where it belongs. This is what drives me crazy about these Sichas, how precise they are. The Rambam, the Rebbe analyzes, puts this in here. It clearly, in the logic, belongs elsewhere. Says the Rebbe, the Rambam is teaching you something. This is not part of the daily schedule. This is not another service. This was part of honoring Hashem's temple, which really is honoring Hashem. And that's why it's here. So that answers. So if that's the case, says the Rebbe, another brilliant innovation. If you're trying to honor me, don't use an allowance. Don't use a loophole. If you're trying to follow the law of the temple, so you can use loopholes, including the loophole that you can suspend the shvus. Do what you got to do. You're following the ritual, the legalities. But if there is something that's all about honor, it's not about following the system of getting the service done. It's not utilitarian, let's call it. It's about honoring and showing love. When you're showing love, you don't bring me a half-baked thing. You know, the example I can think of is somebody's hungry. Give him a piece of bread, doesn't matter how it looks. But if you bring him a birthday cake, it matters. Don't bring him a piece of cake. Bring him a nice cake. It's about the honor. It's not about the eating of the cake. The same thing is here. By the Rambam putting the law of the daily inspection in the section of the honor God, he is indicating that this daily inspection is all about honoring Hashem, showing love to Hashem. When you're showing to honor Hashem, don't do it with loopholes. And therefore on Shabbos, they didn't use the law that Shavuos is suspended. They didn't walk around with torches. They wanted to completely honor Hashem without any loopholes. They walked around. There were no torches. The torches were built in from before. Because when you're honoring, you go full throttle without any loopholes, any allowances. You give them the full honor. And the Rebbe shows a precedent to this in Jewish law and in history. We know that by Hanukkah, Hashem made a miracle. That the temple, that the oil burnt, that oil burnt for 8 days in order for the Jews not to have to use impure oil. So there's a question that's asked, what's wrong with using impure oil? Now, normally that's not allowed, but there's a principle. There's an allowance. There's a halachic allowance that impurity is overridden. It's allowed in the case of communal impurity. The whole Jewish people are impure. You could use impure oil. And here was the case. The whole Jewish people were in a situation, there was no pure oil. We needed it for the temple service. It's a communal need. So you have an allowance. Halacha says the language is tuma hutra b'tzibur, that impurity is allowed when it's a communal problem. It's not just the individual. So if that's the case, and this is asked by many commentaries, why did Hashem have to make a miracle that the oil should burn 8 days so they have pure oil? Use impure oil. It's totally kosher. It's totally kosher. So the answer is given by Pnei Yeshua, one of the great commentaries, says the Rebbe, that being that the miracle of Hanukkah was Hashem wanted to show Chavivus Shal Yisrael, of his love for the Jewish people. He wasn't just trying to help us survive, but he wanted to show his love. As the Rebbe explains in other sichas, that's why we in turn do the mitzvah not by strict law, but not even mahadrin, but mahadrin, mina mahadrin. Why? Because this is all about the love, is a love affair. Hashem went and showed the love of the Jewish people because of what they did with such self-sacrifice, etc. And therefore Hashem gave them a love. And if it's about love, you don't use any allowances. Hashem says, you showed me Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice. I'm going to show you love. I'm not just going to allow you to light the temple by using halachic loopholes of impurity is suspended in communal need. No loopholes. You're going to have pure oil. You don't legally need it. But I'm showing you love. When you're showing love, my understanding here is when you're showing love, just like when you're showing honor, it's about the person. It's not about the utilitarian service. And therefore, it's about the person. I think my birthday cake example is very good. You don't give me a half-baked birthday cake. You don't give me a piece that will just satisfy my hunger. You give me something that looks nice. And therefore, so by the example of Hanukkah, Hashem made the miracle, so to speak, unnecessary miracle, because he was showing love. And when showing love, you don't use allowances. In that case, the allowance that impurity is overridden in communal need. Coming back here, the inspection, the daily inspection of the temple. Once we have concluded that it's not a service, it's not a utilitarian need, just like the other services, but rather it is all about guarding, honor, which is like love. If that's the case, you don't use any loopholes. And therefore, they did not use the overriding of the Shvus. This is so innovative and so brilliant and so bright, so Chelek. The Rebbe is showing you a spirit of the law here at a whole different level, and he's reading it right in Rambam. Based on this, the Rebbe answers question 2. Why is 12 a separate halach? On the face of it, 12 is like a little PS. Here's what you do every day. You walk around with the candles. And if it's Shabbos, you don't take the candles, you use the pre-existing. That should be a separate halacha. And this becomes the conclusion of the entire chapter of guarding the temple, of honoring the temple. Like, why is this even important? In one place in the Sicha, the Rebbe says it shouldn't even be here. It should be in the laws of Shabbos. But the Rebbe says no. Now that we understand that this daily inspection is not a service, but it's actually an honor. And if something is done for honor, you don't look for any allowances. Hence, they didn't use the allowance of overriding the Shavuos. Chapter 12, verse 12, the final closing halacha brings out the honor in the most honorable way. You know what kind of honor we gave Hashem? That we don't even use the loophole of overriding a Shavuos. And therefore, in fact, it makes sense that it's a separate halacha. It's the closing halacha. It's the icing on the cake. It's the flower on the birthday cake. We circulate the temple to show honor for Hashem. And on Shabbos, we don't override the Shavuos because we're honoring Hashem. Fantastic stuff. And then to make it even sweeter, the Rebbe adds another explanation. So once again, I posted the halacha, so we see it in front of us. And the Rebbe has explanation number 2. Again, our main operative question is, why not hold churches? Shavuos is overridden, suspended in the temple. But here too, the Rebbe brings 2 other questions as a way of introduction before he answers that one. The Rebbe says, question 1, why is the honor God here in the laws of the temple, not the laws of daily service? I want to distinguish. Earlier, we asked, why are these 2 halachas about the daily inspection with the torches part of the honor God chapter? Now the Rebbe is asking a different question. Why is the entire chapter 8, which is about honor God, in the laws of the building of the temple, Beis HaBechira? Honor God is a service. It's not a construction thing. All the first 7 chapters are all about construction. Courtyard, the building, the rooms, the Azara, the Vayakhel, the different vessels. It's all a construction situation. Why is chapter 8, which is about a daily thing of God guarding the temple, etc., in these laws? This should squarely be in the laws of daily service. To me, the Musafit. And then there's another question, seemingly unrelated. This is probably why it's in Parshas Vayakhel. Why does temple service override Torah law and not temple construction? We know that the temple service overrided Torah law, not just rabbinic law. This is not just the law of Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. You don't have to worry about rabbinic restrictions. In the temple, when there was something that needed to be done as part of the service, it overrides Shabbos. So they would bring the daily offering in the morning, daily offering at night, the Musaf, we say it every Shabbos in our davening, which involved many malachas, many violations. Anything that had to be done for a service was done. This is biblical violations. It didn't exist. It's not a problem. And yet we learned it from today's Torah portion, that the construction of the temple cannot violate Shabbos. Right? Moshe told the Jewish people, build a temple, but don't violate Shabbos. Why not? If the temple is so special, the tremendous amount of the 39 malachos of Shabbos are overridden in the temple because you have to do the service. So why couldn't they build a temple? So let's start by answering the last question, and then we'll work our way backwards. So the Rebbe brings from one of the great commentaries that the logic is This is the Rebbe's innovation. The Rebbe says, this is the Rebbe's innovation. The Rebbe says, I'll tell you why we cannot break Shabbos when building the temple, and only when doing the service in the temple. The tremendous innovation. But you'll see the Rebbe will substantiate it based on the great commentary, the Gilyon Hashas, Rabbi Yosef Engel, the great genius, which the Rebbe quotes many times. But firstly, the Rebbe says, I'm going to tell you the answer to question 2. Why temple service overrides Torah law, but not temple construction? You see, because a weekday act, a mundane act which is prohibited on Shabbos, when it's happening in a sacred space of the temple, it's not mundane, it's holy. So yes, mundane acts are prohibited on Shabbos, but if they're done in the temple, they're not mundane, they're in a sacred space. However, when you're first constructing the temple, it's not yet a sacred space, so the mundane acts are still rendered mundane. Brilliant logic. So that's how the Rebbe answers question 2. Temple service overrides Torah law because it's not a mundane act. Once the temple is standing and constructed, it's a holy space, it's a holy act. The mundane becomes holy. But while you're building the temple, you cannot override Torah law because the space is not yet sacred. And the Rebbe gives an example, a precedent to this, so to speak. This is from Rabbi Yosef Engel, that we asked earlier, how come by Hanukkah Hashem had to make a miracle of the oil and they couldn't use the allowance, that impurity is allowed in communal need? So we gave earlier the other answer, with Yeshua, that Hashem was showing love and therefore you don't use any allowances. But Rabbi Yosef Engel gives a different explanation. Rabbi Yosef Engel says that the principle that we override the impurity, because we have a communal need to serve it, the temple, is only once the temple is standing. So you have a holy sacred space and you have to serve. You don't have pure, you take the impure. Because the impure almost is rendered pure because you're already in the holy space of the temple. However, in the case of the rededication of the temple by Hanukkah, it's almost like it's being rebuilt. It's a rededication. That's the name Hanukkah. Temple was desecrated, it was, etc. And therefore it was rededicated. It's almost like a reconstruction. When you're constructing anew and you're rededicating, says Rabbi Yosef Engel, you don't take the allowance that impurity is allowed, because you don't yet have the validity of a holy, dedicated temple standing, which overrides impurity. The temple is still under construction, if you will. So the Rebbe borrows that logic to our situation. Now, why is it that temple construction does not override Shabbos, even though temple service does? Because temple construction is not yet a sacred space. And therefore, the mundane work that's done is still mundane. You cannot do it on Shabbos. Says the Rebbe, the sages, we know when they made their restrictions, their Shabbos restrictions, they did it in the same spirit of Torah restrictions. We're dealing here now, we're going to answer again the main question on the top. Why do they not hold the torches? We know that rabbinic restrictions are overridden on Shabbos. Overridden in the temple. So the Rebbe says, listen to this brilliant innovation. The override, just like when do we override Torah law? Once the temple is standing, we already have a sacred space. We don't override Torah law when we're building the temple, because it's not yet a sacred space. So let's first, answer question number 1. The honor guard, we asked another question. Why is the honor guard in these laws of building the temple when it should be part of the schedule? So the Rebbe maintains the honor guard is really part of the building. The mitzvah is that there should be a beautiful temple. How do you have a beautiful temple? The Rebbe points out that the mitzvah is not to build the act of building, but the result that there should be. So how do you have this result that there should be a temple? You have to build one, which is the first 7 chapters, and you have to make it sacred through guard and honor, etc. This is chapter 8. So therefore, the idea of guarding the temple and making it look like a king's palace, that is part and parcel of the laws of building the temple. You might put it this way: building the temple is to make the building a holy temple, and God and the honor guard, which is the chapter 8 of this section of building the temple, is to make it a holy space. The first 7 is to make it the space, and the 7th is to give it its flavor. If Hashem commands you that you should have a holy temple, He wants it to be with all the details of the first 7 chapters, and including the 8th chapter. It should be an honored space. It should be a protected space. It should have the daily inspections. So once we've already accomplished that the daily inspections is part of honor, we accomplished that earlier, and now we're adding to that honor is part of construction. And then we know that construction is not something that overrides biblical law in the temple, because it's the logic the Rebbe gave, because it's not yet a holy space. Similarly, the rabbinic allowance that you can override rabbinic restrictions in temple will not exist when it comes to the honor guard, and will not exist regarding the daily inspections with the flames, which we had already explained. That's part of the honor guard. Why not? Because the honor guard is really part of the building of the temple. It's part of the construction section of the Rambam. Not part of the daily laws of the Rambam, of the daily schedule, because it's all about making the temple and therefore, while you're constructing, you don't override laws. And why not? As we said earlier, because you only override the laws once the temple is deemed a holy space. But if you're in the act of building it, including giving it its flavor by its daily inspections and its daily honor guard, you're busy building that holy space, and it does not yet have the holiness, the sacredness to override Torah law, nor to override rabbinic law, and hence we did not override it on the Shabbos. 2 brilliant interpretations, both coming out of the Rambam's order. This is why this Sicha is so exciting to me. It's like it comes straight out of the Rambam. The Rambam, these 2 laws should not have been here. The whole chapter should not have been here. And the Rebbe says, yes, it has to be here, because the whole section over here in front of us of the daily inspection is absolutely part of honor guard. It's not part of service. And the whole honor guard is absolutely part of construction. Hence, you have the 2 answers. So to quickly review them, the first answer was that that this is all about honor. We don't do honor with allowances and loopholes. And the second answer being that this is part of honor, and honor is part of construction. We don't override Torah laws, no rabbinic laws, while we're constructing temple, only once a temple is constructed. And both of these, the Rebbe brought examples from Hanukkah. And the Rebbe concludes by saying that this explains why this halacha is the final halacha, the closing law on the laws of Beis HaBechira. And we know that when you have a Torah section, there's a siyum, and we always connect the end to the beginning. The first law is build a house for Hashem. This is the beginning of chapter 1 of the laws of the temple. The last law is the law that it doesn't override Shabbos. What's the connection? Now, what doesn't override Shabbos? This inspection business. But the Rebbe says, now that we understand that the inspection is all about honor, and that is the way we are actually completing the building of the temple, it makes sense. You want to build Hashem a home. What's the icing on the cake? What makes it really a home for Hashem? The fact that it's honored. And to use the first point, and what makes it honored, that it will not be overriding any allowances. The Rebbe concludes the Sicha with a fantastic thing. And the Rebbe says, on the Hasidic level, if you will, why does the laws of temple building end with this chapter, this section 12 about Shabbos? The Rebbe was bothered why it's even here and why it's a separate halacha. The Rebbe says it's the bottom line. Because Shabbos is an allusion to the 3rd temple, the time of Mashiach. And it's known that when will we fulfill the mitzvah of building the temple completely in the 3rd temple? Yes, on some level we completed it, we fulfilled it by the Mishkan and the first 2 temples, but ultimately it's completed, it's fulfilled properly, completely when Hashem builds the final temple, and therefore the final bottom line of Beis HaBechira is related to Shabbos, alluding to the Shabbos Beis HaMikdash, which we built by Hashem in the time of Mashiach, which will all be called the day of Shabbos. Concludes the Rebbe and says a fantastic lesson. So it's Shabbos. It's a reference to the time of Mashiach. And we say that they would walk around with these lights. The lights are an allusion to mitzvahs. Their mitzvah Torah or mitzvahs are a light. So the Rebbe says, person can think when Mashiach comes, that's when we're going to do the mitzvahs properly. Till then, so many mitzvahs we can't do, and we can't do them right, and we're so imperfect. Does the Rebbe know? The opposite is true. When Mashiach comes, in a way, Hashem won't need our mitzvahs. And there's a prophetic verse that says that those days Hashem won't even need us, because the world will be perfected. And in fact, our imperfect mitzvahs today are even greater, and they're more needed than the mitzvahs of Mashiach. And where is this listed and hinted in this Rambam? That on Shabbos, they didn't light the candles, they utilized the light from the weekday. Translate that on the Hasidic level. When Mashiach comes, Hashem won't need your light, your mitzvahs. Maybe we'll do them, maybe we won't, we'll find out. But depends, I guess, which era. But that's not going to be the value of our service is not so special then. What's going to provide light? What's going to give Hashem the light of our mitzvahs, the light from the weekday, from the days of exile? The mitzvahs that we do now when it's still dark and it's still not Mashiach. And we have to overcome obstacles to do the mitzvahs. This light illuminates the Shabbos. So this is like the culmination of Beis HaBechira now on the Hasidic level.